I think we'll jump straight in. So as Ethel was saying, Julie and I have half an hour to touch on the topic of taming strategic SME acquisitions, which I think we both agreed is perhaps a rather nice euphemism for saying that we're going to talk for about half an hour of what's loosely being referred to as killer M&A. And I think these days that sort of it captures any variant of a larger incumbent buying a small startup business. So traditionally, the example of killer M&A used to be in the pharma space, where a big pharma company buys up a small competitor that has a nascent pipeline drug that might be competing with its blockbuster. But these days, it really covers a whole range of markets. It's much broader, the universe, and it can capture anything from discussions around tech companies buying innovative startups, not even necessarily directly competing with them, but active in the ecosystem. It captures discussions around acqui-hire, where companies buy up startups for their innovative workforce, and a whole range of other topics. So I think, in essence, the theory of harm around these scenarios is that incumbent players are effectively preemptively trying to buy up a potential rival, either before they become a real threat, or before the transaction becomes reportable to a competition authority, or before there's any real sort of data or other information that would help an authority assess that transaction. And that debate seems to be fueled by this sort of growing unease around the large number of M&A activity that potentially falls under this big buying smaller heading. But certainly from where I'm sitting, we haven't yet seen a huge amount of empirical evidence that would suggest that there's a real concern here, perhaps. And certainly from my experience, I have worked on transactions that fit the rough sort of bigger buying smaller profile, where there have been pro-competitive objectives and indeed outcomes. And, you know, I know from experience that there are real incentives for acquirers to nurture and grow and invest in a small business or an asset or a workforce that they might acquire. So with that, Julie, I think my opening question to you would be, how broadly really should we be casting the net when we talk about killer acquisitions?
I'm sorry, I had a problem with my sound. I think I could hardly hear you, but I think you passed over to me, Jenny. Can I just check that people can hear me, because I was having a lot of trouble with the connection just now, but I didn't know if it was just me. Ethel, could you just confirm the sound is all right?
I can hear you, Julie, but it's a little bit far away and it's breaking up a bit. Is that the same for you, Jenny?
Yeah, it's okay. It's a bit sort of raspy, but it's fine, I think.
Let's try,
okay,
Julie.
Maybe I'll try, and let me know if I should switch off my camera or something at some point. So thank you for having me here. And sorry, I would just like to start with the usual disclaimer that anything I'm going to say today is my own views, not CMA views. So Jenny, thank you very much for introducing the topic. And your question to me, I think, is, you know, how broadly we should cast the net when talking about killer acquisitions in the digital space. And you've rightly pointed out that the policy debate has widen the net much more than when we, for instance, traditionally would look at pharma acquisitions. And I would argue that that's just necessary given the nature of the industry. So, you know, in pharma, challenge to an incumbent might be quite straightforward in a way. You develop a drug which is similar or the same, you come in, lower prices, you get a lot of demand. In digital, that kind of strategy is unlikely to work. If you come in with the exact technology, the same technology as Facebook or Google, and you're very unlikely to make any inroads, because the very large network effects and other scale effects associated to data, which means that there are strong barriers to switching, and The way to challenge these platforms is therefore not by replicating their model, but by coming in with something different, potentially quite different and better. Therefore, we're really looking into kind of quite differentiated types of products as challengers. So to your question is how wide we cast the net, it just needs to be cast widely. So I would argue it definitely needs to be broader than just pure kind of killer acquisition, i.e. buy and close down. It needs to capture differentiated products, potentially very differentiated products and different business model. It may even need to cover complementary products, because what might look like a complementary product now could actually be a platform for entry. So thinking, for instance, the example of Facebook and Instagram merger. At the time that Facebook acquired Instagram looked very much like an input for social media, a camera app. So we need to be a bit careful, I suppose, about what's complementary and what could become a substitute. I would also argue that we should worry about reverse killer acquisitions. So that's where a tech firm, or any firm really, acquires a player in a different market. And we should worry about these in two circumstances. One, if it means that the tech firm, if the tech firm, absent the merger, would have had strong incentives to invest itself into that new product, then there might be less competition, one fewer player in that new market. And the second thing is around building big ecosystems. So adding complementary product to already a big offering, which raises barriers to entry further, etc. So consolidates even more potentially the position of big tech. To the point about acqui-hire, I think not disputing that's probably something that happens. It might happen very often, but we just need to. So this is the idea that a deal may be motivated by acquiring brains rather than technology or a potential competitor. We need to be a bit careful about that and kind of have some sense checks against, in particular, the acquisition value. Again, coming back to Facebook Instagram merger, Facebook acquired Instagram for £1 billion. Instagram had 13 employees. It's just not plausible that this was all about the brains. There was also the technology and potentially acquiring a competitor. In conclusion, I think we need to cast the net wide. That doesn't imply that many of these deals are likely to be problematic from a competition point of view, but certainly where it does require some scrutiny. I'll pass over to you, Jenny.
I think that's really interesting, Julie. And I think what you're saying is sort of we have to. I think what you're suggesting is that enforcement action has to slightly tip the other way. So perhaps from your perspective, there's been under enforcement to date, and maybe we should be leaning the other direction. And I do understand, I understand the nervousness from a regulator's perspective. And I think the numbers that are sort of often bandied about are around the big tech companies having done, 500 or more acquisitions in the last couple of years, and only a handful of them being reportable. And again, I understand that, but I do think there's still a balancing point in terms of, I think even the pharma paper that sort of kicked off this debate identified something like 6% of tens of thousands of deals that they looked at retrospectively as potentially having a killer motive. And likewise, when we talk about hundreds of big tech acquisitions that have flown under the radar, actually often only one or two examples get mentioned as sort of, kind of, would we have done it differently with hindsight bias, like the Instagram acquisition. And to my mind, that's sort of indicative of the fact that tech and digital are quite different in a number of ways. And it is much, much harder to predict, I think, whether a small startup would have gone on to be really a successful rival to the incumbent. And the fact that, out of hundreds of acquisitions, we only reference one or two as ones that have given us real cause for concern, potentially is an example of that. I mean, we know that the vast majority of startups fail. I think it's around sort of 75%. I guess startups also don't just try to compete with incumbents. They are competing with other startups in that sort of broader innovative ecosystem. And I do think in these markets, much more so than, say, traditional pharma acquisitions, we really need to look at dynamic competition. And, the next big thing is unlikely to be just a newer or better version of an existing product, and that makes it inherently really hard to predict what would have happened absent the transaction. And then I guess the final but maybe most important point from my perspective is around investment climate. I think the prospect of being bought out is in itself a really important driver of innovation, and many of these startups are motivated by the potential to either be funded by venture capital, and venture capital itself needs an exit at some point, or the potential of being acquired by an existing industry player. So too much intervention, I think, could have the sort of perverse result of reducing innovation competition in that space. So with all of those sort of, counter perspectives, I guess, from the practitioner's view, how do we balance those considerations? Like, is it right to be so worried that the enforcement balance should swing the other way?
So I guess I suppose we're very far from over enforcement at the moment. So we've all, I think everyone knows about the Fermat stats, but very, very few tech deals by the big tech have been I think none of them have been blocked actually, and only a handful have been reviewed. So we're very far from that. I mean, you highlight some of the risks of under enforcement. I guess it's also the important thing is to bear in mind that there's also very big risks to. You highlight the risk to over enforcement. There's also big risk to under enforcement, massive risk to under enforcement. Yeah. So we have evidence that that there is consumer harm, that the big digital platforms are exercising market power. We know that they have been able, some of them, to sustain their market power for very long periods of time unchallenged. So we need to look at these risks of over enforcement in the light of that kind of, in the light of those big problems of concentration in tech, and also not overestimate, I suppose, the risks of over enforcement. Yeah. So I mean, to your point about innovation chilling, being bought out by Google is not the only. Is not the only way out for small innovators. There's lots of buyers out there. If they get bought out by someone else, they won't get a part of the monopoly rent, but I don't think that's something we should care too much about. And even at a kind of deal level, and so it is possible that, not if you block a merger, it might delay the introduction of the technology that's been bought, but equally, I mean, the big tech also have incentives to develop their own, etc. So I think it's just a delay. So I'm not sure the risks of over enforcement are that big, whereas I think the risks of under enforcement are massive. On your point on uncertainty, I completely agree. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I suppose where I would disagree is that uncertainty should therefore lead us to no action. And I would also, I'm not sure, I think, just coming back on the uncertainty over, what's the next big thing, etc. I think first of all, just because there's uncertainty, it doesn't mean that it's acceptable for a big tech company to just buy everything just in case one of them is the next best thing. Yeah, that's just the worst outcome for consumers. But also, to be fair, big tech is in the best position to know what the next big thing is. Yeah, they've got the market knowledge, etc., to spot what the next best thing is. So the uncertainty for them is maybe not as high as we think. And in fact, I've been just lately in the US. Judicial process, kind of a memo has come out around again of the Facebook, Instagram, showing that Mark Zuckerberg was very much aware that Instagram was a potential challenger to their business at the time of the acquisition. So I guess the big question for competition authorities is how you deal with that uncertainty, and that is complicated. There's been, there's been the Furman report that's shown, that I think quite conclusively that, there's been under enforcement. We've done at the CMA an ex post review of our digital enforcement, which again has shown that, we have a status quo bias as a competition authority, too worried about over enforcing, etc. So we're trying to kind of learn the lessons, I suppose, from these reports. There is debate, obviously, about changing the legal tests, for balance of harms test or reverse the burden of proof. But even within our existing tests, I suppose there's things we can do in terms of dealing with uncertainty. So challenging the status quo bias, accepting that if you're talking about something which is inherently difficult to predict, i.e. quite the future or the development of a challenger, the evidence threshold maybe should be not as high because there can't be that much evidence to hold it on to. And then just generally, I suppose, as competition authorities, I think one thing that we've been probably quite bad at is long-term effects. So focusing a bit too much on short-term effects and not enough on long-term, and accepting that, just because a deal might be good in the short term, might bring about efficiencies, doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at potential harmful effects in the future. So going into a little bit into efficiency effects territory, but obviously you want to have a coherent theory of harm and mechanism by which that harm might occur in the future. Thank you.
That's really interesting. There's so much to unpick there, and I think if we had an hour, I would try to respond to all of your points. But I think it is a really interesting perspective. I guess just a few thoughts from my side. I feel we may have to agree to disagree on whether tech companies are inherently successful in predicting what the next best thing is. Yes, there's the Instagram example, but there will be many acquisitions that we don't talk about because they've been flops. And likewise, arguably venture capital funds should be best placed to predict the next successful business because that's their entire business model. But they too often end up investing in failing companies. So I'm not sure I totally agree with that point of view, and I'm not sure we should assume that every time a tech company wants to buy a small startup, that's indicative of the fact that they're going to be a raging success. But we can perhaps park that. I think the observations around doing more work to understand past practice and what went on in past deals is absolutely, I think, the right way to go about things. As I said in my introduction, I guess the fear from a practitioner perspective is that there's lots of policy debate, which is interesting, but sort of happening in the abstract, when I think it is absolutely right to be looking more closely at evidence of things that went on in past cases. So that sounds right to me. I also think it should be encouraged to try and understand what can be done within existing legal tests and tools before taking drastic steps to introduce new tests, which which may not be desirable from a legal or from a due process perspective. I mean, I think it is interesting to probably observe that some competition authorities have obviously, for example, changed their deal thresholds to try and capture more of these types of acquisitions. And so far, they don't appear to have actually identified very many killer deals. So I agree. I think working within your existing tools is probably the right way to look at these things. But I guess just coming back to my previous point, if we don't have the benefit of hindsight, how then, looking within your existing legal toolbox, do you try and spot a killer acquisition going forward? So what evidence, what type of red flags would you be looking for as an enforcer?
Thanks, Jenny. Yes, I'm sure there's lots of things you'd like to go back on, and me too. But let's focus on the question at hand. I mean, that's really the kind of I suppose, $1 billion question in the context of tech. How do you spot it? It's difficult ex post. It's even more difficult ex ante. So, I mean, red flags, indicators, nothing very original there, but I would say the identity of the acquirer is key, position of strong market power, etc. The acquisition value is something that I think needs to be looked at. If the acquisition value is completely out of sync with the revenue stream of the target, that might, it's not a smoking gun, but it's certainly an indicator that something needs to be looked at in order to understand the rationale for the acquisition and for that valuation. Then, I mean, I think, as I'm talking about as a competition authority, I suppose, we need to build knowledge base. We need to understand these markets better so that we can spot better. And, coming to, so at the CMA, we've kind of been working on that. So we've got the data science team in place now that kind of has a has a technological understanding, I suppose, of how this market works. We've also built our knowledge through, for instance, the digital advertising market study, so understanding Google and Facebook's business models, where their market power lies, etc. That's really useful. And this is the kind of thing that helps us, I suppose, and will help us more in the future to filter out, I suppose, what are the unproblematic deals and kind of focus on the ones that might be problematic. So to your point about, changing thresholds and reviewing lots of deals, I mean, I think you're right, it can't be that you just add a huge workload. You want to kind of understand the markets and be in a position where you can filter out quite easily which ones are unproblematic, and I'm sure there will be many, and focus on the right ones. In terms of evidence and analysis, just two very small points. I suppose one is that, because I'm an economist, I can't help making that point. Economic analysis is definitely not less relevant for these cases, but it is different because we can't use the past to predict the future, or very little. So moving away from quantitative and econometrics, for instance, but much more focus on incentives analysis to understand what the future might look like and dynamic effects. And I was going to ask you a question about internal documents. I don't know, we're a bit low on time, so I'll let you decide whether you want to answer it or whether you just want to go straight to the questions. But yeah, my question for you was that we are using more and more internal documents for obvious reasons, which is that these internal documents show first why, I suppose, the rationale for the acquisition, but also what the acquired, the target's plans were for growth, etc. And I was going to ask you on your views about their evidentiary value, because I'm sure you have some.
I have many. I will try and give a very succinct answer, because as you say, we are probably running slightly over time. Internal documents, I mean, yes, there's such a key focus for competition authorities in merger control reviews, and I agree that they have probative value, absolutely. I think to date, probably competition authorities have tend to give a bit more weight to business as usual documents. So, if you look back over 3 years and all the internal documents talk about competitor X, then yes, there's probably something there. I think on this type of theory of harm, where you're looking really narrowly at deal valuation documents and documents that were created effectively internally to get to pitch the deal and to get approval for internal approval to go ahead with the transaction, I think we need to be much more cautious with those documents and recognize them for what they are, which is often an internal sales pitch to explain a high valuation, possibly in the context of an auction, and try and get sort of internal people on board and rallied behind the deal. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a kill motive there. So I think, to your point, doing then the further economic piece of, okay, actually, how do the deal financials stack up? Is there any evidence of material underinvestment or, a potential other sort of anti-competitive conduct that you can glean from the financials? That seems to me an important next step. It can't only be about colourful language in deal documents.